When a man chooses to stop reaching out to a woman, whether intentionally as a boundary or unintentionally through emotional overwhelm, he enters a space where silence becomes a language of its own. This space between connection and withdrawal is not just a pause in communication. It is an emotional void that triggers deep psychological responses in both individuals. And in romantic dynamics, especially those rooted in emotional closeness or history, this gap becomes a container for everything that was left unsaid, unresolved, or misunderstood. Many men believe that stepping back means neutrality, that by saying nothing, they are simply removing themselves from the situation. But silence is never neutral. It is interpreted, assigned meaning, and emotionally translated by the other person. For a woman, especially one who has felt emotionally tethered to the man, the absence of communication activates her attachment system. It forces her to confront what the silence means, what she represents to him, and how secure she actually feels in the relationship. When connection is paused, women tend to internalize the silence not just as space, but as a shift in emotional safety. She does not only see what you are doing, she feels the why. Was the withdrawal a quiet act of self-respect or an angry punishment? Is the man retreating to process and grow, or has he emotionally disconnected and given up? That interpretive gap is what shapes her next move. Women do not just respond to actions, they respond to the emotional context that frames those actions. And when silence follows closeness, it creates a tension that brings everything in the relationship into sharp relief. In relationships, we often overvalue words and undervalue the psychological impact of silence. But in truth, silence is never empty. It carries the residue of everything you've previously shared: intimacy, conflict, longing, frustration. And when a man stops contacting a woman, she must navigate that silence in the context of their emotional history. If he was consistently present, reliable, emotionally available, and grounded, his silence might be read as a sign of temporary withdrawal. She may interpret it as space he's taking to recalibrate, to think, to decide. But if his presence was inconsistent, emotionally erratic, or tinged with unspoken power dynamics, that same silence may feel like abandonment, punishment, or indifference. For women, relational security is often tied to emotional attunement. A sudden silence disrupts that sense of being attuned to, seen, and felt. Even when intellectually she understands why you might need space, emotionally she is interpreting what the gap says about her place in your world. This interpretation often arises from her past experiences, not just with you, but with others who may have made silence a weapon, a wall, or a disappearing act. So when you stop contacting her, what follows is not just reflection, it's projection. She will fill the void with meaning, and that meaning is drawn from her relational memory. What's equally important to understand is that your silence can also be misread. A man may withdraw as an act of grounding himself, to avoid reactive behaviors, to process his needs, or to set a healthy boundary. But if that internal process is not something she can feel the integrity of, then to her, it can look like disengagement. In truth, many men are not stepping away to manipulate, they are stepping away to breathe. But when women are not given any emotional framework for that breathing space, it gets interpreted as suffocation, abandonment, or rejection. This is where emotional context matters more than strategy. Some men hope that by pulling away, the woman will come running back. But this tactic can backfire, especially if the withdrawal doesn't match the depth of the connection. If she felt safe, loved, and understood, she may move toward you, first cautiously, then vulnerably. But if your silence echoes previous betrayals or emotional coldness, she may use the silence not to return, but to recalibrate her own boundaries. She might begin the process of emotional detachment, not because she no longer cares, but because she no longer trusts that connection will be maintained when it matters most. The space between connection and withdrawal is a psychological arena. In this space, each person projects, protects, and processes. Men often believe they are simply stepping away, but in the emotional world of attachment, every action, especially inaction, has a ripple effect. Women live inside those ripples. They read them, respond to them, and make meaning from them. A woman doesn't only react to what you stop doing. She reacts to what your silence reveals about the emotional fabric of your connection. And often, what she does next is not random. It is a dance with her own vulnerability, her own emotional history, and her own need for clarity in the absence of contact when a man stops contacting a woman. Her first response is rarely strategic or calculated. Instead, it is almost always emotional. This isn't a flaw or a manipulation tactic. It's an authentic expression of how the human attachment system responds to perceived disconnection. For many women, especially those with an emotionally sensitive or anxious attachment style, the experience of sudden silence doesn't begin in the mind. It begins in the body. It is a visceral experience, a quickening of the pulse, a sinking feeling in the chest, an activation of emotional alertness that something has shifted. And before she has time to intellectualize what your silence means, she feels it. The emotional brain reacts in milliseconds. It bypasses logic and initiates a safety check. In that moment, the silence doesn't feel neutral. It feels like absence, and absence feels like loss. Even in cases where the relationship was turbulent or uncertain, that quiet can still register as a rupture. Women, more often than not, are socialized and conditioned to track relational dynamics more closely. From an early age, they're taught to sense tone, interpret expression, decode withdrawal, and manage the emotional climate of relationships. So when a man disappears into silence, the first question that rises isn't, "Why is he doing this?" but rather, "What did I do?" This immediate internalization is not a weakness. It's a reflection of how relationally attuned many women have become through both biology and social conditioning. The feminine psyche often carries an inherited emotional labor: to hold space for others, to caretake, to anticipate, to keep the connection alive even when the signal goes dark. So when you go silent, she may feel not just confusion or anger but shame. She may assume she said something wrong, pushed too hard, got too close, or revealed too much. Her mind races to fill in the blanks, but her body has already issued its alarm. That emotional charge is powerful, and if she's not aware of it, or if she's been hurt before, she may act from that raw place. She might withdraw just as quickly to avoid further vulnerability. She might lash out in confusion, or, paradoxically, she might reach out with heightened intensity, trying to re-establish a sense of emotional control. This is not about needing attention, in the superficial sense. It is about restabilizing a connection that suddenly feels unanchored. The emotional need isn't for contact alone, it's for coherence. She wants to understand what has happened, why it happened, and what it means for her place in your world. And here's the complexity: that emotional response may appear irrational to you. It may look like drama, overreaction, or pressure. but it's often rooted in a genuine attempt to find clarity in the middle of emotional fog. Her nervous system doesn't have access to your intentions. It only has access to your behavior. And in the absence of clarity, she fills in the blanks with stories from her past, stories from her insecurities, stories from how others have handled her heart. So the reaction is not just about you. It is also about every time she was ghosted, ignored, dismissed, or made to feel invisible. Even strong, self-aware women are not immune to this initial wave of emotion. You may believe she is independent and emotionally grounded, and she may very well be, but that does not make her immune to the ache of sudden disconnection. Her maturity may prevent her from acting out, but it won't prevent her from feeling deeply. Her mind may eventually rationalize your silence, telling herself that you're overwhelmed, unsure, or needing space. But the emotional response comes first. That's what sets the tone. As time passes, logic begins to catch up. Once the emotional storm passes, or at least subsides, she will start analyzing. Was this silence intentional? Was it reactive? Is this a pattern or an isolated moment? Is he doing this to punish, to protect, or to process? And perhaps most importantly, does he value me enough to return with clarity? But by this point, the emotional interpretation has already been seeded. The way you withdrew, the context, the timing, the energy, it all plays into how she now frames the relationship in her mind. Her eventual decision to reach out, stay silent, or let go is born not from strategy, but from the way her heart made sense of your absence. That's why it's crucial to understand that in the early stages of your silence, a woman's reactions are rarely filtered through reason. She reacts from the heart, the gut, the nervous system. What she says, does, or avoids in those early moments is a mirror of how deeply she felt connected, and how safe she felt within that connection. Her emotional response is not a test, it's a signal that speaks volumes about her emotional investment, her fears, her needs, and the importance she placed on the bond you once shared. Before she has the chance to logically map out her response, she has already emotionally traveled through the first terrain of loss, uncertainty, and vulnerability. And how she continues from there often depends on whether your silence deepens her confusion or ultimately leads to a restoration of trust and understanding. When a man stops reaching out to a woman, a subtle yet powerful shift begins inside her. Not always visible on the surface, but unmistakably alive in her emotional body. It is the moment her heart moves from presence into inquiry. This isn't the type of test that's rooted in games or manipulation. It is a psychological and emotional exploration that happens almost instinctively. She begins to assess not just that you're absent, but why, and more importantly, whether the absence reflects an emotional truth she can live with or one she needs to protect herself from. This is where her intuition becomes a tool of emotional survival. A woman who once felt held by your presence will feel the rupture of your silence as a tremor in the foundation of what she believed was real. But before she reaches out, before she says anything, she pauses. She watches, she listens for what is no longer being said. Her silence, though it may seem passive, is often a careful emotional investigation. She begins to test what your withdrawal says about your connection. Is it an act of emotional clarity or emotional confusion? Is it a respectful boundary, a silent punishment, or an exit disguised as space? These are not just thoughts that pass through her mind. They are emotional sensations that guide her next steps. The testing is often internal and quiet. It's not always expressed through action. You may not see her doing anything, but in her emotional world, she is observing everything. She notices the way you disappeared, the timing, the tone of your last interaction, and the pattern of your past behavior. All of it becomes data in her emotional radar. She's not judging, she's interpreting. She's attempting to reconcile what she felt from you when you were present with the message your silence now delivers. The more inconsistency she perceives, the more urgent her need becomes to understand the truth of the disconnection. This process is especially intense if she experienced emotional rupture in previous relationships. If silence was once used as a weapon against her, as abandonment or emotional manipulation, she becomes hypersensitive to its presence now. Her body remembers what her mind wants to forget, and so your absence becomes more than just a lack of contact. It becomes a test of emotional safety. She is not only asking, will he come back? She is also asking, is it safe to want him too? Some women will respond by leaning in, reaching out, and attempting to reconnect. But even in that gesture, there is a quiet testing. She is not just looking for your words, she is listening for your energy. She wants to feel whether your silence was born of reflection or rejection. She wants to sense if you are returning with presence, or if you're merely resurfacing out of guilt or habit. Her emotional body is always attuned to the deeper layer of your intention. This is why surface-level apologies or vague check-ins may not land. She is not looking for words, she is looking for congruence between your actions, your timing, and your emotional state. Other women may respond in the opposite direction. They may become distant, restrained, even cold. But this too is part of the emotional testing. She wants to see if your absence was conditional, if you only value her when she is actively reaching, pursuing, giving. In that silence, she begins to reclaim emotional clarity for herself. She asks, perhaps not aloud, but in her heart, does he miss me, or did he just enjoy being wanted? The more she feels that your silence lacks emotional substance, the more she begins to emotionally recalibrate her investment. For many women, the emotional testing is not about trying to control you. It's about trying to understand you, to understand what your silence means about your depth, your emotional maturity, your capacity for connection. This is where men often misread the situation. They think she is playing a game or trying to win power. But in truth, she is navigating the invisible terrain of emotional risk. She is deciphering whether your withdrawal was an act of emotional self-regulation or emotional avoidance, whether the connection was a place of safety or simply a passing experience. She also tests herself. She reflects on what it meant to be vulnerable with you, to open, to trust, and to feel. She considers if she overlooked signs of disconnection while trying to stay close. She questions whether her feelings were held or merely received. The silence becomes a mirror, not just of you, but of how she showed up, and what she needs now to feel whole again. If your silence creates a sense of deeper understanding in her, if it feels like a space where clarity might be born, she may choose to wait, to hold space, even to hope. But if it echoes the past, if it reminds her of times she lost herself waiting for someone to return with honesty, then her emotional testing will lead her toward boundaries, protection, and eventual detachment. She is not testing to see if you love her in the way of fairy tales. She is testing to see if your absence contains truth, and if that truth is something her heart can carry without losing herself in the process. Desire is a complex, paradoxical force. It does not always grow in closeness. In fact, in many emotional landscapes, desire is awakened in the presence of space. This paradox is often misunderstood, especially in romantic dynamics where one partner suddenly withdraws or becomes silent. When a man stops contacting a woman, he may do so to protect himself, to establish boundaries, or simply because he feels lost. But what he rarely anticipates is how that very silence, when situated within a relationship that once held emotional charge, can reignite something unexpected in her longing. The longing that emerges in absence is not a linear response. It is not a predictable formula. It doesn't mean she wants you back, or that she suddenly forgets the pain, or the confusion that may have led to your distance in the first place. What it does mean is that, in certain relational contexts, absence can stir emotional energy that had once gone dormant. This is the paradox. We often feel the desire for connection most strongly when connection becomes uncertain. But this awakening of desire depends entirely on the emotional substance that existed before the silence. If a woman felt emotionally nourished, seen, and respected by a man, if she experienced moments of depth, resonance, or vulnerability with him, then his sudden silence does not immediately erase what was felt. Instead, it can heighten the memory of those moments. The human mind has a tendency to revisit the past in times of confusion. And when the present becomes quiet, the past speaks louder. She remembers not just what was said, but how she felt in his presence. The quality of that emotional residue determines whether her longing is warm and open or conflicted and painful. Desire born of distance, however, is not a sign of emotional immaturity or romantic weakness. It is often an invitation to look more closely at the interplay between availability and attraction. For many people, consistent availability is comforting, but not always stimulating. When someone is always there, always predictable, always responsive, we may begin to take their presence for granted. But when they step away, especially without clarity, their absence begins to take shape in the imagination. We fill in the blanks, we revisit the feelings, we wonder, and it is in that wondering that desire is often reborn. Yet this dynamic is delicate. The kind of desire that emerges from absence is not sustainable without foundation. If the connection prior to the silence was shallow, inconsistent, or emotionally one-sided, then distance does not increase desire, it increases doubt. A woman may initially feel the sting of rejection, the ache of missing someone, but it will not evolve into deepened longing. Instead, she begins to emotionally detach as a survival mechanism. Her desire becomes conditional, contingent on whether the silence was a momentary retreat or a signal of emotional unavailability. This is where the internal dialogue within her begins to shift. She may start to feel the first waves of desire in your absence, but alongside that desire comes a reckoning. She begins to ask herself not just if she misses you, but why. Is it genuine connection she's longing for, or is it simply the unresolved tension, the narrative left open, the part of her that wasn't given closure? The desire itself becomes part of the questioning. She wonders whether what she feels is a reflection of her emotional truth or a projection onto someone who has already chosen distance. In emotionally rich relationships, distance can deepen appreciation. It can invite reflection. It can make her see parts of you that were previously overshadowed by familiarity. She might recall how you listened, how you looked at her, how you made her feel safe, or excited, or challenged. And in that remembering, desire breathes again, not out of desperation, but out of recognition. Yet this awakening is fragile. If the silence lingers too long, or if it becomes a pattern rather than a pause, what began as desire morphs into resentment. She begins to grieve not just the loss of the man, but the loss of the possibility that was once alive between you. What's important to understand is that the desire she may feel in your absence is not necessarily about you returning. It's about something unresolved coming to the surface. She wants to resolve the emotional dissonance. She wants to know if the connection was real. She wants to know if you pulled away because you couldn't go deeper, or because you were afraid of how deep it had already become. Her longing is not a promise. It's a question, searching for clarity in the shadows of your silence. Some men interpret a woman's longing during silence as validation. They assume that her feelings confirm their value. But what they miss is that the desire she feels is often mixed with grief, with confusion, with hesitation. It is not a wide, open door. It is a doorway filled with memory, hope, and caution. She is not simply waiting. She is thinking, feeling, revisiting, re-evaluating. Desire exists, but it exists within a landscape of complexity, and unless it is met with emotional presence when contact resumes, it cannot survive. In the paradox of desire and distance, absence alone is never enough. What matters is the emotional meaning behind the silence, and whether it serves as a bridge back into intimacy or as a wall that ultimately closes her heart. When a man chooses to step back and stops reaching out, the woman on the other end doesn't merely respond to the silence in its raw form. She responds to the energy behind it. The human heart, especially a woman's heart trained by intuition, emotional awareness, and often years of attunement to subtle relational shifts, is acutely sensitive to the emotional quality behind actions. Silence is not judged simply as a lack of communication. It is felt, assessed, and interpreted in terms of its emotional texture. A woman will instinctively begin to read the energetic climate left in your absence. Not all silence feels the same. There is silence that feels like peace, and silence that feels like abandonment. There is a difference between withdrawing with emotional integrity and withdrawing as a form of control or escape. A woman can feel when your absence carries clarity versus when it carries confusion. She can sense when you're taking space to reconnect with yourself, to center your emotions, to avoid impulsivity. And she can also sense when the silence is laced with avoidance, punishment, anger, or detachment. Her response will mirror not just the act of silence itself, but the emotional energy embedded within it. The energetic climate is determined by everything that happened before the silence began. It is shaped by your last conversation, the way you handled previous conflict, the consistency of your presence, the depth of your vulnerability, and the respect you offered in your emotion expressions. If the climate before your withdrawal was warm, intimate, and grounded, even if marked by struggle, then your silence might be interpreted as a pause, an interlude, a breath. She may still feel held by the emotional tone you left behind. In that case, she might give you space with compassion, even curiosity, trusting that there's a deeper process happening beneath the surface. However, if the emotional tone you left behind was sharp, cold, unclear, or erratic, then your silence begins to feel like a threat to her nervous system. It activates her defenses. She may begin to anticipate the worst, not because she lacks emotional resilience, but because the energetic climate does not offer reassurance. The absence in that case becomes not just a moment of quiet, but a psychological uncertainty. Her nervous system reads it as emotional danger. Something important has shifted, but she doesn't know why. She doesn't know if you've left emotionally, if you're punishing her, or if you're waiting to be chased. Women do not only read your behavior, they feel your presence or absence in a nuanced, embodied way. The silence that follows emotional inconsistency can feel like emotional abandonment, even if that wasn't your intention. You may think you're doing the right thing by stepping away, perhaps to calm yourself or to process, but if you don't leave behind a coherent emotional signal, she is left to guess. And in that guessing game, the mind creates stories to protect the heart. The story she tells herself about your silence becomes her emotional reality, even if she does not say anything. If she mirrors your silence or appears indifferent, she is still responding. Her silence might be her way of matching your energy, not out of spite, but out of emotional self-protection. If your energy feels closed, unpredictable, or emotionally disengaged, she may retreat into her own internal world to regain a sense of stability. Her stillness isn't necessarily peace. It might be a survival response. She withdraws to avoid the pain of misreading your cues, of chasing something that feels unstable, or of opening to someone who is no longer emotionally available. This is why so many misunderstandings occur during periods of no contact. Men may believe their silence is sending one message, while women receive something entirely different. You might think you're giving her space, but if the space feels emotionally empty or passive, aggressive, it won't be received as respectful. It will be received as rejection. You might believe you're preserving the relationship by avoiding conflict, but she might interpret it as you emotionally checking out. The emotional climate you create is the message, and silence only amplifies what was already in the air. There's also the matter of energetic residue. The woman will recall your tone, your facial expressions, your body language in the moments leading up to the silence. She will remember if you were distant, distracted, overwhelmed, or tender. These emotional details linger far longer than most men assume. Women hold on to this emotional data, not because they're fixating, but because they're trying to make sense of the gap. The emotional residue of the last encounter becomes her internal reference point for understanding your silence. If that residue was loving, she may wait with openness. If it was cold or dismissive, she may begin to grieve before you've even walked away fully. And perhaps most importantly, a woman doesn't just want presence. She wants true presence. If and when you return, what matters most is the quality of your energy. She will listen to your words, yes, but she will be scanning for sincerity. She will feel for emotional congruence. She will notice if your tone matches your intention. She will watch your eyes, listen to the pauses between your words, and sense whether you are returning from a place of self-awareness or out of guilt, obligation, or confusion. Her openness will be shaped by whether the energy you now bring feels safe, authentic, and emotionally grounded. And she will trust or retreat based on what she feels more than what she hears. In the delicate dance of silence and connection, what often goes unnoticed is the emotional choreography unfolding beneath the surface. When a man chooses to step back, to stop reaching out, he is not simply creating distance, he is initiating a series of emotional and psychological processes that ripple through the woman's inner world, Her reactions, far from being random or reactive, are layered with meaning, shaped by history, intuition, and the energetic footprint he left behind. She does not merely respond to absence. She responds to the emotional truth carried within it. At first, she feels. Her body registers the change before her mind can make sense of it. She questions not just him, but herself, wondering what the silence means and what it says about her place in his life. In that pause, she begins a quiet investigation, testing the emotional truth of the withdrawal, sensing whether it holds clarity or confusion, care or detachment. And if there was once warmth and resonance, she may find herself drawn closer, not out of weakness, but because desire often breathes more fully in the presence of distance. Yet desire alone is not enough. It must be met with substance, with presence, with emotional coherence. Ultimately, her response is not to the silence alone, but to the energy that lingers in its wake. A woman's heart, trained by years of emotional listening, will discern whether your absence speaks of emotional integrity or avoidance. She may choose to wait, to retreat, or to walk away entirely, not because she stopped caring, but because she could no longer hold what was emotionally incoherent. In this dance between contact and disconnection, it is not the silence itself that defines the outcome, it is the emotional meaning embedded within it, and whether it leads back to connection or becomes the quiet that marks the end